Hi, welcome to the Communitarian Podcast. The aim of such a project is to explore and examine the philosophy of communitarianism, the central premise being the emphasis of the community as opposed to the individual. Unsurprisingly, such a broad philosophy can be found to be part of the subject matter of religion, science, and politics, and much more besides. Therefore, in no particular order, I will explore such ideas. Thanks for listening, and leave your comments below. Part 3. Kropotkin's Alternative Approach. All the various factors have now been considered, which conclusively provide an answer for why we don't take such evidence seriously. So far I have found Kropotkin's claims concerning the origin of social instincts and its relation to morality to be well-founded and compelling. What does Kropotkin suppose we do with such an alternative approach? His project is to reconsider morality free from all prejudice and restraint, which has plagued its development so far. Instead, we must now consider our natural origins as the, quote, origin of all ethical concepts and all subsequent development of morality, end of quote. This is what Kropotkin describes as a positive way of investigating morality. Positive in this sense means that it has the ability to inform judgments and its progress can be charted. The only alternative is a negative approach, based on superstition or metaphysics, and can only provide very vague and uninformed analysis. Instead, Kropotkin encourages us to think of such a scientific project as reaffirming our faith in moral progress. Also, it provides a source of confidence that no matter what institutions or theories may claim, the, quote, principles of morality remain unshaken, end of quote. Such a project is set out in his work, The Ethics. Quote, ethics aims 1. To establish the origin of moral concepts and sentiments. 2. To determine the fundamental principles of morality and work out in this manner a proper, i.e. one that answers its purpose, moral ideal. End of quote. Regarding his first objective, we have only discussed his evolutionary case for the origin of social instincts. However, now we have to discuss in greater depth and examine the initial consequences of such an analysis. His second objective will be explored later. Moral sentiments. How do we explain the existence of moral feelings which influence our behaviour? Such a line of inquiry has been woefully ignored, either by claims that it is religiously inspired, or that such feelings are inconsequential or irrelevant. Kropotkin instead lets us now consider a positive attempt to research and explore moral sentiments. Kropotkin asserts that it is incorrect to imagine that human beings have two hostile elements conflicting with one another, that of selfish pleasure-seeking and that of impartial moral purity. Instead, Kropotkin agrees with Jeremy Bentham's analysis that, in fact, all actions are motivated by pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Such a simple observation is actually quite easily lost. This is mainly because religious thought insists on such a division. For instance, consider a religious monk. We have all become very accustomed to thinking of such a spiritual life as regimented and free from personal pleasure. The opposite seems to be the case. Such behaviour is primarily motivated out of pleasure, the pleasure to be closer to God. Let's consider the consequences of such an analysis when considering moral behaviour in general. We would have to conclude that actions such as stealing food from a malnourished infant would in fact be motivated by pleasure of such a behaviour brought. However, the dichotomy works both ways. For instance, to feed a malnourished infant would in fact be motivated by pain. Pain? Why not pleasure of seeing an infant survive? It would be motivated by pain, since the situation would cause pain and suffering to the one observing such a fate. Put simply, we can suffer when we see others suffering. Of course, our actions are not limited to being motivated by pain or pleasure. Instead, they are simultaneously both acting together. Such an analysis has made no judgment on what motives should influence what behaviours. Instead, it has explored the basic mechanism of moral behaviour. However, it would be very tempting to conclude that such an analysis, by its very nature, cannot be prescriptive, and instead allows morality to fall into subjectivity. The problem with such a conclusion is that it fails to take into consideration the greater context of being a human being. are social instincts. Social instincts provide the context and therefore inform what we as human beings tend to find pleasurable or painful. It is our instincts which enact an immensely powerful emotional framework based on biases towards feelings of benevolence, sympathy, and solidarity. We do not live within the confines of our thought experiment. Instead, we view the world through this lens. To give a cut and dry example, suppose we see a child being beaten. Instinctively, we are affected by such a situation. How can we make sense of such a visceral reaction without supposing the prominence of social instincts? There's no reasonable alternative. Religious reward or utilitarian calculation seems hopelessly inadequate. Kropotkin cites two important figures who have articulated such a realization. The first is Adam Smith within his work Theory of Moral Sentiments, which he claims is far superior to his other works based on political economy. The other figure he speaks very highly of is Mark Gile, in his work A Sketch of Morality, Independent of Obligation or Sanction. I was personally mesmerized by the following quote from Gile. Quote, "We are not enough for ourselves. We have more tears than our own suffering can claim, more capacity for joy than our own existence can justify." End of quote. It is only a naturalistic explanation that can plausibly provide an insight into the lows and highs of our moral lives. On one hand, the feelings of inadequacy resulting from guilt, and on the other is the self-evident magnanimity of a life lived morally. Explanation of guilt. If men were only concerned with self-interest and their own desires, then what is the purpose of guilt? It clearly does exist, and there is only one plausible explanation. Let's consider the crude example of such guilt in action. A man steals food from another who is about to go hungry. The act of theft was clearly motivated by the desire and pleasure of consuming such food. Why is it, after reflection, that such an individual feels guilty? Both Darwin and Kropotkin identify a key characteristic necessary to identify such a visceral reaction. Firstly, guilt manifests itself only when an individual reflects on their actions in comparison to the expectations of their social instincts. To quote Darwin, "The social instincts are ever present and persistent." End of quote. The second requirement is the transient nature of desire. To quote Darwin again, "The enduring and ever-present social instincts had yielded to some other instinct, at the time stronger, but neither enduring nor leaving behind a very vivid impression." End of quote. Or, as Kropotkin puts it, quote, "Its satisfaction is always weaker than the desire itself, and when we think of it in the past, we cannot revive it with the same intensity that it had been before its satisfaction." End of quote. Guilt is the inevitable fallout which occurs when reflecting on our present social instincts, which brings to attention the implications of our actions on others. We then suffer their pain as if it was our own. Virtue as a capacity. How does our social instincts explain the inherent attraction we have towards moral improvement? It is an incorrect assumption to insinuate that our social instincts somehow represent a perfect blueprint which only requires our obedience to fulfill. Such a thought does not accurately consider virtue within the same sphere as any other capacity. Therefore, virtue as a human capacity has the potential of being habitually practiced to become stronger and ever-present. Moral cultivation. Kropotkin explains the purest expression of this is when individuals act with unflowing tenderness, goodwill, in service of others without expecting anything in return. Such actions can even include acts of self-sacrifice. As Kropotkin boldly praises, quote, "Such men and women as these make true morality, the only morality worthy the name." End of quote. So far we have discussed the experience and reality of a moral life. However, Kropotkin is clear that such an investigation cannot stop here. Instead, we are encouraged to rationalize the expressions of our social instincts, as he explains. Quote, "Ethics must answer this question. It would not be sufficient simply to point to biology. Ethics must demonstrate how moral concepts were able to develop from the sociably inherent in higher animals and primitive savages to the highly idealistic moral teachings." End of quote. All such things have a humble beginning, and put simply, this is his analysis. As we have evolved, so too has our moral concepts and teachings. They have developed gradually through the process of accurate reflection, particularly the desires of the individual in comparison to the demands of the social instincts. Over time, the tension between these two interests have been rationalized into a harmony. This is what we now recognize as concepts of duty and justice. From here, Kropotkin asks an intriguing question. If our social instincts are the most congenial explanation for our moral lives, why don't we allow them to inform our future development? Such a line of inquiry represents a second objective in his work The Ethics. Quote, 2. To determine the fundamental principles of morality and work out in this manner a proper, i.e., one that answers its purpose, moral ideal. End of quote. The spearhead of Kropotkin's ethical project is to acknowledge the rational basis for moral values, which, if properly understood, could re-establish faith in moral progress and provide a critical analysis of the society we live in. That's the end of part 3. Thanks for listening. Part 4 is titled, How Does This All Relate to Anarchism?